everybody. Thank you all for coming out on this very muggy Sydney day. I've flown up from Melbourne and I'm not enjoying it at all, I have to say, but it's very good to be here. My name's Emma Dawson. I'm the new-ish Executive Director at Per Capita, so welcome. I'd like to acknowledge that we are meeting on the land of the Gadigal of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. And thanks to Cause, to Stephen Price, for hosting us here today. Cause have been a long-standing partner in Per Capita's Reform Agenda series. They've actually been our partner since the inception of the Reform Agenda series around 6 years ago, and we are very grateful for their ongoing support. I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Andrew Leigh here to speak today on the reasons for rising inequality in Australia. It's a topic particularly close to our work at Per Capita, which will be focused on fighting inequality in Australia over coming years. I'd like to acknowledge my predecessor, David Hetherington's here today, our board members, Jeff Gallop, and our chair, Helen Conway. I won't speak for too long, other than to say we appreciate all of your support for Per Capita. If you haven't already, please sign up to our newsletter on the way out and grab some of the materials that we've got here today. You can find out a little bit more about what we do. But I'll now welcome Stephen Price from Cause to introduce Dr. Thank you.
Thanks, Emma. Thank you very much. My name is Stephen Price. I'm the Chairman of Cause Chambers Westgarth. It is a great pleasure to welcome Per Capita and its members and guests here to Cause. It's also a particular pleasure for me to welcome Dr. Andrew Leigh to speak to us today. Andrew, as you know, is the Federal Member for Fenner and is the Shadow Assistant Treasurer and Shadow Minister for Competition. Prior to being elected to Parliament, he had an incredibly impressive academic career, earning his PhD from the Kennedy School of Government from Harvard University, where he continued as the Frank Knox Fellow for 4 years, prior to returning to Australia as Professor for Economics for 2004 to 2010. I think we are particularly lucky in Australia to have people such as Andrew Leigh with the CV that he has, and I do acknowledge there aren't many who have the same CV, but who make the great sacrifice to stand for Parliament, where they are able to not only represent people, but make a particular stand for a vision for Australia. We're also doubly lucky when they have somebody such as Andrew who's able to do it with a particular vigour and thoughtfulness and decency which he brings to the public debate. So this afternoon, Andrew Leigh will be speaking to us on inequality in Australia and its rise, and it is a great pleasure for me to bring Andrew Leigh to the stage. Thank you, Andrew.
Well, thank you, Stephen, for an extremely generous introduction. Can I too acknowledge the meeting on the lands of the Gadigal people and pay my respects to elders past and present. To acknowledge the Per Capita family, Emma Dawson, Alison Orr, Helen Conway, David Hetherington, Jeff Gallop, and many friends and colleagues in the room. It would be remiss of me not to acknowledge that my parents are here today. It's always good fun getting to give a speech for your parents in the room. And of course to acknowledge Stephen Price and the support of Cause for allowing us to enjoy your hospitality, your refreshments, and of course this beautiful view. No better place to watch Sydney showers than from the perspective of a high-rise building like this one. I'd also acknowledge that Per Capita has recently made inequality its core purpose. And I really commend Per Capita for doing this. I think it is a marker of the importance of this issue, and it's a real pleasure to be speaking about inequality in this important Reform Agenda series, a series that I've always admired since then Prime Minister Julia Gillard launched it 6 years ago. There's many forms of inequality, but perhaps the starkest is the difference between those who own no assets and earn their living by selling their labour, and those who earn vast assets and can live off the proceeds. Between those two extremes lies home ownership. It's not a perfect marker, but if you don't own a home, it's likely you live by the sweat of your brow. Conversely, if you're living off your investments, it's a pretty good bet that you own your home. At the end of World War II, Australia was a nation where just 53% of households owned their homes. In the major cities, the figure was just 46%. Most city dwellers rented. Most homes were made of wood or fibro-cement. Then in the post-war years, something remarkable happened. The Australian home ownership rate soared. By 1954, it was up to 63%. By 1961, it was up to 70%. In just over a decade, the distribution of Australia's housing wealth became markedly more equal. And it wasn't just homes. Shared prosperity in the post-war decades meant cars became cheaper. By the 1960s, most Australian homes had a vacuum cleaner, a washing machine, a television and a fridge. Items that before the war had only been owned by the most affluent. Even access to university was shared out more evenly. For someone like my grandfather, Keith Leigh, attending Melbourne University would have been impossible on a modest clergyman's wage. Only a post-war veteran scholarship made it possible. The intellectual seeds for those changes were sown in John Curtin's white paper on full employment and his clearly professed view that there will have to be a fairer distribution of wealth. The surprising thing is what happens next. Under Robert Menzies, the coalition didn't choose to mount a stirring defence of property investors. They didn't choose to rail against attempts to increase home ownership as socialism by stealth. Instead, they presided over a steady rebalancing of the economy, and even went so far as to incorporate home ownership into their story of what the new-built Liberal Party stood for. With the home ownership rate now the lowest it's been in 6 decades, it's worth remembering the Liberal Party hasn't always been the party of landlords. When it came to wages, Menzies presided over average wage growth 5 times faster than it had been in the first 4 decades after Federation. With today's Conservatives fearful of a wages breakout, it's worth remembering Australia once had a Liberal Party that valued strong wage growth. Equality is a Labor value, but it isn't just a Labor value, it's also an Australian one. Robert Menzies knew this, but I sometimes wonder if his intellectual heirs do. This is the second of 3 talks on inequality in a series I'm calling Just Ideas. In the first talk, I focused on the question of why we should care about inequality. Today, I'll be looking at the drivers of inequality. In the final talk, we'll look at what we might do to reduce inequality. So let's start with the role of union membership. At the time of Australian Federation in 1901, union membership was fairly rare, with about 1 in 10 workers in a union. But over the next dozen and a bit years, the share of union members quadrupled, reaching 4 out of 10 by the outbreak of World War I in 1914. Not coincidentally, this was also the period of the most rapid growth for the political party representing organised labour, the Australian Labor Party. For Labor the party and Labor the movement, the early years of the 20th century were heady days indeed. From 1920 to 1980, the union membership rate in Australia averaged 49%. That's where it was in 1982. Then it began to plunge. It was down to 40% in 1992, 30% in 1997, 20% in 2006. According to the latest figures from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, 15% of Australian workers are now in a union. In the United States, the figure is 11%. Now, at this point, it's worth noting that the Australian Bureau of Statistics figures are for 2014. More recent data from the Australian Council of Trade Unions suggests a higher membership rate. But with that caveat in mind, let's stick with the Bureau of Statistics figures, since they allow us to look at different subgroups. Their headline figure suggests that union membership now is back where it was in 1906, 110 years ago. Among private sector workers, the official union membership estimate is 11%. For those born overseas, it's 12%. For workers aged under 25, just 7% are in a union. Among the industries where union membership has now fallen below a tenth are accommodation, agriculture, defence, printing and the performing arts. If the current rate of decline continues, the overall union membership rate will reach 10% in 2022. Over the years, unions have brought lasting gains in the workplace. Sick leave in the 1920s, annual leave in the 1930s, the 8-hour day in the 1940s, unfair dismissal protections in the 1970s, banning asbestos in the 1980s, the weekend. Careful economic research finds unions have a causal impact on making workplaces safer. And today, unions are making the case for domestic and family violence leave. Unions, too, have often found themselves on the right side of history. Maritime unions refused to load pig iron onto Japanese ships in the late 1930s because they foresaw the risk that it would come back in bombs. When 200 Gurindji people walked off the Wave Hill cattle station in 1966, it was the trade union movement that supported the right of Indigenous people to be fairly paid. If you've ever enjoyed Centennial Park and the Sydney Botanic Gardens, you should thank the union members who stopped them being bulldozed in the 1970s. Unsurprisingly, unions also increase wages. One recent study finds that unions increase wages by 5 to 10%. Which isn't a bad return, considering that the average union membership due is less than 1% of salary. But for the purposes of thinking about inequality, it's important to note that the impact of unions is strongest on the bottom of the distribution. Unions often campaign for dollar pay increases rather than percentage pay increases, for pay equity across workplaces, and for pay equity between industries. The 2012 social and community sector workers case is a good example of this. In that case, the 5 unions noted that around 80% of workers in the social and community sectors were women. They argued that because they did caring work, they'd been systematically underpaid, compared with those in other occupations who had comparable skills and worked in similar conditions. Fair Work Australia agreed and laid down an 8-year transition to better pay for those workers. But as union membership declines, it'll be steadily more and more difficult for these kinds of cases to be brought. One analysis by Jeff Borland estimates that in the 1980s and 1990s, declining inequality was responsible for up to a third of the increase in Australian, declining unionisation was responsible to up to a third of the increase in Australian wage inequality. And that parallels what's been found in Britain and in the United States. To illustrate the point, let's take the gender pay gap. Using the Melbourne Institute's Household Income and Labour Dynamics in Australia survey, or HILDA, I calculated the gender pay gap in hourly earnings across about 8,000 workers. Among non-union workers, women earn 13% less than men. But among unionised workers, women earned 7% less than men. Unions approximately halved the gender pay gap. The same is true for Indigenous workers. If they're not in a union, Indigenous people earn 18% lower hourly wages than non-Indigenous workers. But if you compare those who are in a union, the racial pay gap falls to 5%. In other words, 2/3 of the racial pay gap is gone among unionised workers. In both cases, gender and race, unions don't close the pay gaps entirely, but they make a huge difference. So every time you see someone proposing policies that make it harder for unions to organise, remember what this means for our economy. A larger gender pay gap, Indigenous Australians being left further behind, and more economic inequality. Another big driver of inequality is the twin forces of technology and globalisation. They're best discussed together because they interact. For example, most technologies Australia uses weren't invented here. But they also are worth discussing together because they impact our economy in a similar kind of way. Let me take a simple example. Suppose we created a magical machine that turned iron ore into televisions. You dump a shipload of iron ore into the machine and it magically churns out 2,000 televisions. We might call that magical machine trade. You can also think of the change in terms of trade as being a bit like a big technological improvement. By the peak of the boom, the way that trade machine worked is when you dumped in a shipload of iron ore, it spat out not 2,000 but 20,000 televisions. And in general, both globalisation and technology tend to increase the wages of those further up the distribution. Machines are particularly good at taking the jobs of routine workers, which is why we've seen a huge decline in Australian occupations such as typists and bookkeepers. If you line up Australian occupations in order of hourly wages and graph the change in the number of positions, then you get a U-shape over the last few decades. In Australia, as in many other advanced nations, the labour market's increasingly become polarised. And as those middle-paid occupations disappear, the people who did them have cascaded down into lower-paid occupations. There's more demand for jobs like security guards and baristas. But because those occupations don't require a great deal of training, the increase in demand for their services hasn't translated into a big increase in wages. In the case of globalisation, we know that open markets have brought significant benefits to Australia. For example, an analysis by the Centre for International Economics found that trade liberalisation over recent decades benefited the Australian household by around $4,000 annually. But it's important to also remember the distributional impacts of trade. Since the work of Wolfgang Stolper and Paul Samuelson, economists have recognised that while trade raises aggregate living standards, appreciate the thunder to emphasise the point, the benefits aren't evenly shared across the community. From Peter Cook to Craig Emerson, Penny Wong to Jason Clare, Labor's trade representatives have consistently held the view that market liberalisation must be accompanied by a strong safety net. Free trade and social democracy go together. Recent United States studies have reinforced the importance of this approach. In the 1990s, America imported twice as much from developed as from developing nations. Among economists, the consensus back then was that trade had only a small impact on inequality. But now in the United States, developing country imports are higher than developed country imports. And work by David Order and co-authors suggests that trade might in fact have a larger impact on inequality. I haven't seen a similar analysis for Australia, but it's worth noting the change in the composition of our imports. In 1990, the average wage in our top 5 import supplying nations was 95% of the average Australian wage. Today, the average wage in our top 5 import supplying nations is 56% of the Australian average. Now, this isn't an argument against open markets. It's a reminder of the importance of active labour market programs and a strong social safety net. Another big driver of inequality is the tax system. Analysing top income shares in 5 English-speaking countries, Tony Atkinson and I estimated that about a third of the increase in top income inequality in the past generation was driven by reductions in top marginal tax rates. Indeed, over the course of the last 100 years, it's astonishing how closely top income shares track the after-tax share at the top. In other words, 100% minus the top marginal tax rate. Now, there's good reasons why Australia reduced the top marginal tax rate from 60% in the early 1980s to 47% in the 1990s and 45% in recent years. But it's important to recognise that the benefits of further rate reductions at the top go overwhelmingly to the most affluent. For example, on the 1st of July next year, the Coalition's 2% temporary budget repair levy will cease. And that'll effectively provide a 2% income tax cut to that top tax bracket, which starts at $180,000. By my calculations, 94% of the benefits of that tax cut will go to the top 1% of adults, a group that's doubled its income share in the last generation. I'm just not sure that group needs another tax cut. And then there's the question of the breadth of the tax base. During the Hawke-Keating years, Australia saw the introduction of capital gains taxation and fringe benefits taxation, closing off significant tax loopholes used disproportionately by those at the top. By contrast, the Howard years saw a halving of the capital gains tax rate for long-held assets and the creation of new superannuation tax breaks, to the significant benefit of those at the top. Similar debate arises when we look at the transfer system. When it comes to reducing inequality, the Australian social safety net has traditionally been the best targeted in the world. According to UNSW's Peter Whiteford, the average advanced country gives twice as much welfare to the bottom fifth of the population as to the top fifth. But Australia gives 12 times as much to the poor as to the rich. As with tax, there's nothing automatic about this outcome. Under the Howard government, the redistributive effect of government payments declined by a quarter. Labor took the opposite approach when we were in government, by increasing the use of means testing to ensure that those who received transfer payments were those who really needed them the most. Anytime we tweak the tax transfer system, it's worth remembering we're dealing with the most efficient inequality-reducing welfare system in the world. Bolt on a regressive paid parental leave, as was proposed by the Abbott government, and you make it less efficient. Increase waiting periods for young people to access unemployment benefits, and you increase inequality. Change pension indexation so it's linked to prices rather than wages, and you increase inequality. Or, as I mentioned in my last talk, increase the pension, as happened in 2009, and you can move 1 million people out of poverty. The final driver of inequality I want to talk about today is market concentration. And I want to be the first to admit that my views on this have changed markedly since 2013, when I wrote Battlers and Billionaires. Back then, I barely touched on market structure as a factor driving inequality. And if you'd asked me my view on market concentration at that stage, I probably would have said I didn't think market concentration was a very serious problem, and that the Hilmer reforms in the early 1990s had done most of the necessary work. My view started to shift when I read a terrific book by my friend and co-author Tony Atkinson, titled Inequality, What Can Be Done?, which argues that excessive concentration is a key driver of inequality. At around the same time, The Economist magazine published an analysis of competition in the United States, which showed that across 893 industries, markets were heavily concentrated, and that since the early 1990s, 2/3 of US industries had become more concentrated. This prompted Australian National University researcher Adam Triggs and I to conduct a similar study on Australia, published this month in the Australian Economic Review. Unlike the United States, where a government agency collects data on market share, our Australian analysis relied on figures collected by IBISWorld, a private firm that carries out research on a variety of industries. To be precise, we went through 481 IBISWorld reports and crunched the figures to calculate the industry share of the big four firms. Now, a common rule of thumb in industrial organisation is that a market's concentrated when the big four have more than 30% market share. On that benchmark, most Australian industries are concentrated markets, with the average market share of the big four coming in at 36%. Triggs and I find that Australian markets are more concentrated than in the United States, where the average market share of the big four is 33%, recalling ours is 36%. Just to take a few concrete examples. In the US, the big four liquor retailers have 10% of the market. Here, they've got 78%. Their big four health insurers have 35% of the market. Ours have 93% of the market. Their big four cardboard box manufacturers have 36% of the market. Ours have got 88% of the market. And there's a plethora of Australian markets where the big four have not more than 30%, but more than 80% of the market, ranging from baby food to beer. That's partly due to more mergers. The number of mergers that took place last year was 3 times as many as in the early 1990s. The value of those merger deals, more than 10 times as high. Another indication that rising concentration is a drop-off in the number of firms in the economy. There are around 20,000 fewer Australian firms now than in 2012. For all the talk about startups, new firms are significantly less likely to get off the ground today than they were just a few years ago. The startups are stopping. Increased market concentration hurts consumers directly through higher prices and less variety. And disadvantaged consumers can bear the brunt of this. The poorer you are, the more likely it is that you spend your entire paycheck. Low-income consumers are less able to avoid excessive markups by driving to the next suburb or hopping online to get a better deal. And when you think about the production side, some of the excess profits from market concentration in a highly unionised economy would have flowed through to wages. But with union membership at a 110-year low, it's more likely to show up in executive salaries or profits. And, as it happens, CEO pay has massively outpaced average worker salaries in recent decades. And the profit share has also risen. Incidentally, market concentration might also be responsible for the slump in business investment we've seen recently. So, if anyone asks you what this talk was about, here's what you might say. The big drivers of inequality are union membership, technology, globalisation, taxes, transfers, and market concentration. Put another way, the best friends of egalitarianism include a fair transfer system and good unions, while some of the biggest challenges are robots and monopolies. There's one other big driver of inequality I haven't mentioned, and that's education. I've held off talking about it today because I want to focus on it properly in my third and final talk, on what can be done about rising inequality. So please, watch this space. But because we're headed into the Christmas season, I wanted to wrap up by saying something timely about one simple tool to reduce inequality. Weekend loadings, commonly known as penalty rates. Now, as every economist knows, weekends and public holidays exist for one simple reason: to solve the leisure coordination problem. Suppose 2 people want to meet up in a park one morning to kick a football around. In a world without weekends, both would have to coordinate their schedules with their employers. But in a world with weekends, they can simply choose to get together on a Saturday or a Sunday. If we didn't have weekends, there'd be a whole lot less sport, music and social activities in the world. What weekend loadings do is they discourage employers from rostering people on weekends unless necessary. In some cases they're passed on to customers, as with cafes and restaurants that pass on a surcharge to customers on weekends and public holidays. But weekend loadings also have an impact on inequality. To see this, I took another look at that Melbourne Institute Hilda survey to see who works on weekends. And it turns out that weekend workers tend to be lower paid than average. Those who work on Saturday and Sunday earn 80% of what those who work only Monday and Friday get. Weekend loadings go to people who tend to earn less. Now, often inequality can be complicated and statistical, but sometimes the role of public policy economists is to cut through the dross and say it like it is. Cut weekend and holiday loadings, and you'll make the nation less equal. If you love Australian egalitarianism, one simple way to defend it is to support lower paid workers getting a bit extra for working when everyone else is on holiday. In advance, best wishes for the holidays. Thank thanks for listening today. I look forward to your questions.
Thanks, Andrew. A lot of food for thought there, and I'm sure we'll all be keeping our ears peeled for the third in the series. Andrew's kindly agreed to take some questions. Would anybody like to kick us off? Yeah, here at the back.
Andrew, you talk about the decline in union membership. I would pose this to you. Even when the union was in full flight fighting against work choices, perhaps you care to put me right if I'm wrong, but I don't remember hearing any stories about a surge in people rushing in to join unions because of the Your Rights for Work campaign. It seems to me that in spite of what they delivered, and in spite of all the threats that were coming true in people's lives as a result of work choices, people weren't inspired by and large to join unions. How do you answer that?
Yeah, so it's a great question as to how you turn around the decline in union membership, and it's something that I know many of those in unions are thinking about now. One of the challenges, of course, in Australia is that our laws don't permit an agreement which applies only to union members. So those who don't pay their union dues receive the benefits of wage rises that are advocated for by unions. A good deal of the decline in union membership has occurred due to changes in industrial composition, and it's harder to organise in services than it is in the manufacturing sector. But some of the creative approaches that are being tried include thinking about full service unions, unions which work on a range of issues that matter for their members outside just the narrow industrial set of issues, focusing on making it easier to join, better use of technology, and working in the community building space as well, because one of the really important roles for unions in the past hasn't just been in fighting for better pay, but also in, say, introducing a new worker to their team or organising the lunchtime soccer competition. But I don't think anyone has quite cracked this nut, and I think that's, you see that from the fact that this is not just a story in Australia, but also in a lot of other advanced countries as well.
Question over here.
Thank you very much. I've always agreed about the targeted social security system being the most efficient, and also advocating full employment. But in light of what you've been saying, for example, about the rise of robots and technology, what do you think about the growing debate on the left about a universal basic income?
So my simple answer is please don't give me welfare. I'm in the top 2% of the Australian income distribution, and if your policy is that we should have a cash payment that goes to people in the top 2% of the distribution, then there's only two ways we can pay for that. A massive increase in tax rates, which would put us above where the Scandinavian countries are, or by demolishing the entire social safety net, including the National Disability Insurance Scheme. When I make that argument, people who advocate universal basic income often say, well, I don't mean that you should get it, I mean that we should have a system which is tailored and is available to those who don't work. To which my response then tends to be, well, now we're talking about tweaking the existing system rather than tearing it up and starting again. And I think that's a reasonable place to be. And we do need to worry, for example, about say some workers who have been working manufacturing jobs all their lives. Their bodies are worn out. It's difficult to imagine that retraining will move them into another satisfying and worthwhile job, but they're still a decade away from pension age without superannuation entitlements. That's a space in which I think there's more work that needs to be done.
Andrew, I know you're a fan, a colleague of Thomas Piketty, because I saw you open his talk at the Opera House. I'm a little bit surprised that given what he says about the relative value of capital versus labour and how whenever you advantage capital, you get massive inequality. You haven't spoken about that quite as much in this particular talk. He points to the fact that capital receives 5% return through all of history, labour from 0.1 to occasionally 0.5% or thereabouts. Of course, we also know that capital is required to develop the country, but What is your formula for rebalancing inequality by looking at how we advantage capital in this country?
So I've got huge respect for Thomas, and was touching base with him on a French political issue this morning. But I think his story of capital and labour doesn't perfectly apply to Australia. It's a better story to explain what's been going on in Europe over the 20th century than Australia over the 20th century. Our story of rising inequality over the big sweep of the century is largely a story about differential wage rates rather than about about capital versus labour. That's not to say capital versus labour mightn't explain a lot of what's going on in the future. And one of the reasons I started with housing was a concern that increasingly we might have a two-tier economy with a group of people who are locked out of the housing market, not just in their own generation, but for their kids, because if the only way of getting a house in Sydney is to have your parents leave you one, then we become a painfully immobile society and a more unequal one.
Andrew, you talked about the U-shape, the hollowing out of the middle class, middle skilled jobs. Do you see that hollowing out continuing kind of up the skills and income chain, where increasingly more skilled and better paid jobs are hollowed out through digital disruption? And more broadly, could you comment on the debate in economics about whether digital disruption leads to less demand for labour overall, or whether there are going to be new types of employment and labour activity created that we just haven't thought of yet because we can't understand the technology environment that we live in?
So, David, I think the answer to your second question is we're not quite sure. The economic history is littered with examples from the Luddites to Keynes of people predicting that technology would cause widespread unemployment, and that hasn't in general come true. On the other hand, this is a pretty big technological shift to hit the world. What we can be fairly sure of is that technology is going to continue creeping into unexpected parts of the distribution. Moore's law means that computing power is doubling every 18 months. So, you know, imagine the power that we have now. In 18 months, we've got twice as much. In 3 years, we've got 4 times as much. In 4.5 years, then we've got 8 times as much. In 6 years, we've got 16 times as much. 16 times the computing power. Suddenly, problems that just seemed impossible for computers to solve become a whole lot more tractable. And, you know, since we're in a law firm, you think about the initial ways in which computers moved. So first, computers did the work that the typing pool had done. So I assume there's no typing pool in cores any longer. There would have been one in the cores of the 1980s. Is it right? Okay.
They're unionised.
But you know, largely typing pools have gone, and then the work of discovery, which engaged junior lawyers in looking for patterns in large numbers of documents. A lot of that's being done by computers. But then more and more sophisticated work that lawyers do will increasingly be taken over by artificial intelligence, and that same process will continue across the labour market. The challenge is to think about where new opportunities might arise and providing broad educational skills so people can go into those when they arise.
Question here. Thank you, Andrew. Very thought-provoking. I'm interested in your views. You referred to monopoly as being the enemy, or one of the enemies. Your views on the knock-on effects of privatisation within Australia in recent decades.
So I thought it was interesting to hear Rod Sims earlier this year say that his view on privatisation had shifted somewhat after seeing a number of privatisations where essentially all the government had done was to change a public monopoly to a private monopoly, and where the public monopoly had managed to nonetheless, the public monopoly wasn't acting as a profit maximiser, the private monopoly was acting as a profit maximiser, and social welfare was decreased. We want to be pretty careful about selling stuff where there's not competition in the market, and I don't think it's enough just to say, well, we'll let the regulator have a go at tackling this. You might, in some cases, want to just keep it in public hands.
Andrew, I know your final talk is going to be perhaps about rebalancing. but I'm a person who sometimes likes to read the last page before I
Absolutely.
before the middle. When it comes to rebalancing, I retired in the mid-2000s, and so was an immediate beneficiary of Peter Costello's superannuation changes, which must be about the worst economic decision since the war, but I didn't object to it. And we saw the Gillard government had to exclude over-resourced schools from being, had to have their funding reduced. People were benefiting from negative gearing and not saying, oh, yes, we want changes to negative gearing and capital gains tax. The people who are going to be rebalanced are probably not queued up to support this, if that's the strategy. I'm not saying it is, but what are your comments on perhaps how rebalancing might, a bit of rebalancing might take place?
I think part of it is about ensuring that investment goes into productive assets, and increasingly what negative gearing has done is it's encouraged people to put a very large share of their wealth portfolio into assets which don't support the productive capacity of the economy, and also to concentrate their portfolio in one particular asset class. Good investments would suggest that Australians should be buying a larger share of equities and a smaller share of property. So people are taking on more, they're more exposed to housing risk in the market, but they're also not contributing to the productive capacity of the economy. So as you do that, as you ensure that you've got more market competition, these are not just equitable reforms, they're efficient ones as well.
Andrew, I'd just like you to reflect upon the discipline of economics for a second. There's been some commentary recently about the role that economics has played in the general growth of inequality, the view that perhaps we're not in control of things as we might have been because we don't have the technical instruments, and we don't have the technical instruments because we don't have the knowledge base to develop them. And, you know, I suppose the general theme is if you go back to the post-war era which you mentioned, which I was in a sense still living in when I started studying economics at the University of WA in 1969, Keynes dominated. Macroeconomics dominated. And in as much as we were concerned with microeconomics, it was a backup. And full employment was actually a goal. Since then, of course, microeconomics, for obvious reasons, has come more into the equation, and with globalisation you could imagine that it had to. And of course, with the excessive protectionism we had in Australia, people like Gough Whitlam and that realised they needed to shift towards a more micro approach. Bob Hawke did with his resale price maintenance policies and whatever. But where does economics fit into this, do you think, as a discipline? Because if we're going to have a more equal society, it's got to be science-based and it's got to have good knowledge behind the proposals we put up. Is economics currently capable of doing what Lord Keynes did back in the post-war era, or Nugget Coombs did in the Australian? Is it capable of doing it, do you think?
Jeff, I feel like this is a bit like asking the Pope whether Catholicism's up to scratch. But let me try and be a little self-reflective about a discipline which essentially shapes the way in which I think about every serious problem in the world. To the extent that economics is putting ideology before data, we can get ourselves into serious strife. So the people I've quoted today, Jeff Borland, Thomas Piketty, Tony Atkinson, Adam Triggs, these are people who essentially are going where the data points them. And in that sense, one of the things I love about a good economics paper is it'll have a question in the title, and it'll be a question whose answer the person writing the paper didn't know before they started. And I have to say that's not true of a lot of social sciences. When I talk to people in many other social sciences or humanities, they won't talk about working on a question, they'll talk about working on a problem. And it's a problem whose answer they knew before they began. So the spirit of open exploration is a pretty healthy one, and we want to encourage that. But as a profession, we've also got to be pretty firm in stamping out people who are speaking without data backing them up, and people who are willing to talk beyond the limits of what we know. Saying, I don't know and we need more evidence is something that ought to be celebrated. Having your prior beliefs disproved is something that we ought to enjoy personally. If someone provides you with rigorous evidence as to why you were wrong, you should be extraordinarily grateful to that person, and the best economists are.
Andrew, I listened to your discussion this morning with Frank Kelly, but I heard the article prior to that, or much of it, which went towards trying to explain the number of people on the streets in South Korea at the moment. And in the article was included a reference to the fact that some 60% of the workforce in South Korea is now a contingent workforce, casual, part-time, contract, whatever. So I wonder whether you've got an equivalent figure in Australia, and are we trending the same way? And to what extent is that a risk to our social cohesion in our society?
Yeah, I mean, we've certainly got a rise in casualisation in Australia, and you worry about jobs which are too fragile to support a mortgage or to raise a family. One of the possibilities is that we want to think about a greater variety of employment structures rather than simply employee or contractor, have a smoother continuum of different employment structures. Daniel Mookie in the New South Wales Upper House is doing some very thoughtful work on this and about the question as to whether we could provide a greater social safety net by improving the portability of say, annual leave, sick leave across work. We also need to get the superannuation piece right. I mean, there's data today showing systematic underpayment or large-scale underpayment of superannuation, along with the fact that we don't pay super unless you earn more than $400 a fortnight. I suggest that the superannuation system isn't doing as well as it should for people in fragile work.
Question over here at the back.
Oh, hi.
G'day.
The question, there's a lot of people in this country that feel that they have been hard done by, and we're seeing that in the polls of the Rise of One Nation in various places. And one of the things that we've seen globally is that it's never the best policy, but if the swing voters don't buy those policies and fix things where they are, then it doesn't matter how good our policies are, that's the capital or down in people may end up voting for One Nation. So I suppose I'm asking you economics, what insights from behavioural economics do you think you can bring to bear in Labor's upcoming campaign to try and get those voters that are voting for One Nation to say no, Labor has better, objectively better economic policy? Because it seems like a lot of times people can vote against their own interests.
Yeah, so it's obviously something I've worried about a lot. My natural instinct is to think that the best form of politics is good policy, and that the real danger in this space is becoming a snake oil salesman who's willing to say anything in order to get elected. If you think that the rate of churn among governments is increasing, then you should be more concerned about keeping your promises and about having a stable set of ideas from opposition, because if you don't tell people what you're going to do before you get elected, the chances of being able to deliver on that are smaller. I think there's useful conversations to be had around home ownership and around the stability of work, around the rate of growth of wages, and around the structure of our society. They're conversations that resonate pretty strongly. But yeah, it's a challenge of progressives to think about how you can make your message sticky to make it part of a barbecue conversation. One of the striking things about Donald Trump is he doesn't have a great field operation, doesn't have a whole lot of as many people out knocking on doors as Hillary Clinton. What he has is a surrogate field operation, which is that his outrageous statements are picked up and talked about by people with their friends. And so just as Hillary Clinton's people are going into households themselves and having conversations, Donald Trump is generating grassroots conversations about himself. what are the things that progressives should do to generate those sorts of conversations we want to happen is perhaps one way of viewing things.
Got time for a couple more questions. I'll have the back here.
Hi, Andrew. Two questions. The first is about rural, regional, and metro. There's been a lot of publicity in the Sydney Morning Herald, Terry Walmsley. I think it's research showing that rural New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia, and Queensland are all effectively in recession. So any comments you have on that in terms of really an increasingly unequal society between Sydney, Melbourne, and the rest? And the second one is, I have to ask you for your top key points about education. I work in community education, and I can't wait to know.
Yeah, well, so to answer the second question first, obviously community education is where it's at. It's about focusing all our attention onto community education. No, look, I'll go into the sort of educational twists and turns in the third talk. But the headline is that I think we need to focus on educational quality as much as educational quantity, and that's true at schools, vocational training, and also university. If you can get more learning packed into a single year, that's more valuable than getting people to stay in education for another year. And the state-by-state data, Saul Estlake had some figures about 18 months ago that suggested that the degree of cross-state inequality hadn't risen. I'd be interested to see that updated, because I was in Tasmania recently, and it certainly feels like the state of the labour market and the housing market place it in a different decade from Sydney. Yeah, but so I was in Ravenswood outside Launceston. It's a place where the average income is $32,000. That's per household, not per person. Where you've got 16% unemployment and a manufacturing base that's continuing to erode. So yes, it certainly feels, I don't know whether it's in recession or not, but it certainly seems to be doing it much tougher than many other parts of Australia.
Thanks, Andrew. Just a question, if you've got some of the themes from the other side of the floor there. I feel like the case for doing something, taking action to reverse the trend of rising inequality is pretty clear. But I find it doesn't really get as much traction politically as I would have thought. And I'm wondering what you think about that, why that is, if it's something to do with the analysis, our understanding of the drivers and the solutions that we present, or if it's a communications issue.
Yeah, so first of all, I'm very pleased that Emma's focusing per capita's energies not just on the policies, but also on the politics of inequality, thinking rigorously about how to make these ideas sticky. I'm not sure that more worthy conversations about changes in the Gini coefficient are necessarily going to mobilise a mass movement marching in the streets. So then it comes down to sort of storytelling, to making things simple. You know, one of the big drivers of changes in the US tax code around earned interest deduction, I think it was, came because Warren Buffett pointed out that his tax rate was lower than that of his secretary. It was a crisp, easy to understand fact, and it was sticky, and it brought the case for change. So thinking about ways in which the sort of large morass of technical data, as found in Thomas Piketty's brilliant book or Tony Atkinson's brilliant book, can be turned into political campaigning is really important. You know, one very simple fact, the length of super yachts has increased. A super yacht of the 1980s wouldn't be a super yacht today. It would be too small. And whether it's really necessary to have super yachts going from being 40 metres to 80 metres in a world in which 5% of Australian households say they won't be able to afford Christmas presents for friends and family is one way of thinking about inequality.
I actually think that's a pretty great way to think about inequality, and probably a good note on which to end today. Thank you, Andrew.
Lovely. Thank you. So
we've touched on a lot of different issues today that talk that speak to the experience and the reasons for inequality in Australia. And as Andrew alluded to, Per Capita will be focusing on these issues in the years ahead. And I'd like to ask all of you to join with us in that open spirit of inquiry that Andrew referred to earlier. There are a lot of questions to be posed and a lot of answers to be found, not just about the policies that we need to develop to fight inequality in Australia, but about the political engagement and how we tell those stories. So I can't let this captive audience go without saying, please join our mailing list if you haven't already. And if you wanted to make a donation to the cause, it would be very gratefully received. We're a small organisation. We've got some great thinkers and some great associates involved. And we really do intend to put our backs over the next few years into coming up with ideas and practical solutions for fighting inequality in Australia. So before I let you go, I would like to thank both Andrew Leigh for speaking to us today with the second in a series of what I think are very compelling speeches to the Australian politic, and we look forward to the third. So thank you, Andrew, for coming along. I'll get Alison to give you a gift. And thank you to Stephen as well for hosting us here today at Cause. We, as I said, greatly appreciate their ongoing support of Per Capita and the support of all of you, and we look forward to seeing you next time in Sydney. Thanks for coming.